The Wedding Part 1 is the 24th episode of the second season of Everybody Loves Raymond. This is directed by Jeff Melman, and as always there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. And despite the fact that ordinarily I do not care for flashback scenes or flashback episodes, I actually quite liked this one, and it's also left me very curious to find out what happens next. I can't remember. I have seen this episode before. I can't remember the details, and I wasn't expecting to enjoy this. I definitely wasn't expecting to be looking forward to the next part, but of course, I'll talk about that part when we get there. This one starts off with Ray getting dressed really smartly, and he says, we're not going to be dancing at this event. And Debra says, but I like dancing. And Ray asks her, kind of joking a little bit, if you knew I didn't like dancing, why did you marry me? And Debra's response when she said, I'm thinking, I thought was very funny. And then the rest of the episode is the flashback. And it starts off with Ray still living with Marie and Frank at the time, and he is practicing with a ring box. Kevin and Andy then come over, and he manages to shoo them out just in time for Debra coming over, and she's brought over a bag of carrots and Planet of the Apes, and they go and sit on the plastic-wrapped couch to eat the carrots and, in theory, watch Planet of the Apes. But Ray has, obviously, got bigger plans, and he shows her this newspaper, and she starts to read this column, and she realises it's Ray's column. And he was telling her that he got the job as a columnist, which is really exciting. I love how excited for Ray Debra was. Frank then comes in because he forgot his driving glasses, and he ends up reading this column. And initially, he's really proud, and his response is really heartwarming. And he begins to read what I think is really beautiful. And there is one quote that I'll share in a moment that I love, but Frank kind of took it in a way that I don't think Ray was meaning, because Ray is writing about how he loved sports as a child, but he also loved the rides home after the game, where he would talk with Frank about the game. And he says, and I quote, what drew me to the games as a young boy was the ride home. And I love that. I love the fact that, yes, he loved going to the sporting events, but what he loved most of all was the time with Frank. And Frank kind of read it as, I never communicated with my son, which is not completely unreasonable, but that's definitely not what Ray was going for. Frank is not in a happy mood, but then Marie comes in and she finds out about the column, and her response is just amazing. I absolutely loved it. And Frank is reading out the column, and he's reading it quite angrily, and he's basically shouting it. And then he gets to the last line, which is, Debra, will you marry me? Which he just basically shouts out. And then there's this pause where everybody kind of realises what he's just said. And Marie asks Debra what her answer is. And she says yes, and she's really happy, really excited. And then there's a kind of awkward moment, and this moment wouldn't mean anything if we'd watched this episode. Let's say, for example, this was actually the very first episode. This moment wouldn't mean anything, but knowing what we know about Robert, when he walked in, I couldn't help but laugh, because Robert has just walked into the room where everybody has found out that Ray has made columnist, and he's just got engaged. Because after all, everybody loves Raymond, and I just found it to be very funny. The following morning, Ray and Robert are at the breakfast table. Ray asks Robert to be his best man. It's really sweet, really adorable, really lovely moment of bonding between them. And then Ray begins to worry. And we know Ray is a worrier. This is not the first time we've encountered this. He begins to worry that Debra felt like she had to say yes because the whole family was there. And then he started to think, hang on, I put it in the paper. So of course she's going to have to say yes, because everybody's going to know that Ray asked her to marry him. And he started insulting his own looks. I think Robert was really supportive. I really liked the value that Robert brought into this, even though it didn't really help Ray. And Ray goes over to Debra's flat, and he realises he hadn't even given her the ring, because obviously the engagement didn't quite go the way he expected. He gives her the ring, and she begins squealing. So when he's trying to ask her, are you sure you want to marry me? He's not really getting a straight answer out of her. I don't think at any point there was any doubt that Debra wanted to marry him. I certainly don't perceive that, but I can understand why Ray felt the way that he did. And then Debra starts to show Ray all of these wedding plans that she's been working on since she was 12, and she's basically got everything planned out already, which is kind of not unique. I think a lot of people are in that situation. Personally, I don't understand it, but I guess that's largely because I move around a lot. So if I planned my wedding when I was 12, it definitely wouldn't be the same now, or pretty much every other year of my life. I'm never in the same place for very long at all. But Debra has this great plan, and then her parents come over and they start basically dictating, with Debra playing along, about this big wedding that she's going to have. And Ray asks her, I thought you were okay with a small wedding of about 20 people. And Debra doesn't agree with this. And I don't like this shift in Debra's attitude, because when it was just her and Ray on their own, she was very supportive of him and listening to his thoughts and feelings. But now she's with her parents, it's kind of like she's falling back into ways that are maybe not the most friendly. We obviously know that her parents are sometimes considering themselves above other people. I say that I don't know if we've encountered that in the show yet, or if I'm thinking of episodes in the future. But either way, her parents are definitely from a different class than Marie and Frank, so it's a very different kind of upbringing that she's had, so she might have different attitudes to Ray. And this is kind of what we see when she's around her parents. She's kind of falling back into that attitude, and it's not great to see, and it's very overwhelming. Even just watching it feels overwhelming, so we can only imagine how Ray felt in that moment. And once Debra's parents came over, what Ray felt or wanted didn't matter. It's almost as if he wasn't even part of the wedding. And honestly, I feel like that could be a very common occurrence. I'd like to think it isn't, but it wouldn't surprise me if it is. And I'm just so surprised that I genuinely thoroughly enjoyed this episode. Because as I said, there will be some exceptions, but in general, I don't care for episodes that are flashbacks. I just find them to be dull. But actually, this isn't the first time we've had a flashback in Raymond, and I think I remember liking the previous one as well. So that's very promising, and definitely something that works in the show's favour. Really looking forward to the next episode. Obviously, we know how it concludes. We know Ray and Debra get married, because we've just had 2 seasons of their marriage. So that would be a little bit awkward if that's not what happened. But I am keen to see particularly how Ray responds to things, and whether Debra continues to behave differently when she's around her parents to how she is when it's just her and Ray. We'll see. I can't remember. I genuinely have no recollection of the next episode, so that works in my favour. Really looking forward to it, and I'm very, very pleasantly surprised by The Wedding Part 1.